Hey, thanks so much for listening to the Ridge Community Church podcast. My name is John. I'm one of the pastors on staff at the Ridge, and our vision is to bring the hope of Jesus into every home. So as a piece of that, our goal each week is to bring you something that's hopeful and helpful. So subscribe to this podcast to make sure you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations. Hey everyone, and thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge Community Church podcast. If you find today's episode hopeful and helpful, then please follow or subscribe, and then rate and review so that more people can find the conversation. Today's episode is the second part in a two-part conversation that I got to have with licensed professional counselor Amber Wirth. In this part of the conversation, Amber shares some really great advice on how to help a significant other or a close friend who's struggling with a mental health challenge. We chat about setting expectations in a relationship when there's a mental health challenge and how to talk to someone just in general who's struggling. This is part 2 of my conversation with Amber.
Listen with an open heart and mind with gentle curiosity rather than judgment or intentions. I think it's really hard for us to put aside, what we already think and like our intentions of what we already want to spit out and say, rather than staying grounded, monitoring our own anxiety in the midst of the others. And so sitting in, it's uncomfortable. Like you said before, it can be really uncomfortable. It can be really scary. It can be like being vulnerable with how we're really feeling can be in itself traumatizing. Like, what if the other person judges me? What if the other person thinks I'm crazy,
Yeah.
But sitting through that and understanding allows us to feel human and connected with the other. Because we relate in our suffering. We relate with our strong emotions and our traumas. And so that space and just sitting with the other can be really powerful healing.
Yeah. So is this more in a reference to because this kind of sounds like there's like multiple layers to this, right? So there's one side where it's like being willing to listen to someone else as they're processing is helpful for ourselves, but then also being able to be vulnerable is helpful for ourselves. Is that kind of like the dual sides of it?
Definitely, because both sides have to be vulnerable in the process. I'm going to put my intentions aside. And I'm going to notice myself and my own anxiety in the midst of the others in experiencing anxiety. And so it's a concept called self-differentiation by a marriage and family therapist, theorist called Bowenian. And I love utilizing this and teaching it to people because it's being able to connect deeply with the self and our own anxiety and our own feelings while also engaging and processing and being able to sit with the other well in their anxiety. So staying in the room, staying present, continuing to be grounded in the midst of the other anxiety as well.
So it sounds like there's something powerful to be about. I don't know. I think it's easy to, or maybe not easy, but there can be the temptation to, if your partner is struggling with a mental health challenge, to almost separate yourself from that issue entirely. Like, okay, well, I'm good. I'm fine. And so I can listen to you and I'll be fine. Right. But really, everybody's got something that's going on in one way or the other. And so without, unless you are willing to acknowledge, how is their processing affecting me? You're not going to really be able to even help them. Is that fair?
Right. Yep. Absolutely. Or, in your mind and, you're thinking of already kind of going through your brain of what you should say and what you should do and what they should do is not necessarily that helpful, because you're not necessarily then sitting in the moment with them and actually hearing them out.
Yeah. So could you maybe share a little bit more about that? If you're having a conversation with your significant other about their mental health challenge, is there some things that you should avoid doing? I'm sure there are.
Yeah. This, there's a lot of, yeah, things that are, I have helpful versus not helpful.
Yeah.
And so I like to sort of think it that way.
Yeah, definitely.
Because symptoms of trauma are so scary. They're terrifying, right? And when we are vulnerable and we are experiencing pain and symptoms that feel so real to us, the last thing we want to do is be shamed, right? The last thing we want is someone to not try to understand us or sit
Yeah.
with us. And so the helpful things that I always say is if you're with someone and they're really experiencing a lot of scary things and emotions, to say, what do you need from me right now?
Hmm.
Just very basic, but like not the intention of not with intentions. It's like, what do you need contextually? How can I help you right now in this moment? Because like people just, a lot of people don't want advice. Like, hey, suck it up, buttercup. Like, stop worrying, And you're like,
Yeah,
what's
that's the most
Mom?
effective advice is,
Yeah.
just stop feeling that way. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Good
Yeah.
to go. Yeah.
Yeah. What are you so worried about? Gosh, like
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
fine.
yeah.
Like,
Right.
gosh, that
Yeah.
spirals our shame into another level of, my gosh, I feel even crazier now. And you can't just say, what are you so worried about? Why can't you just stop worrying?
Mm,
If we would, we could, right?
right. Yeah. So is that like part of it is just being willing to acknowledge what the other person's going through and not minimize it? Is that a portion of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, definitely not minimize it. It's how can I try to understand even if I'm not experiencing that?
Mm,
What is it like to have a panic attack? What's it like to feel utterly hopeless and not feel like I'm meant to live in this world? Like what does that feel like? What does it
yeah.
feel like in your body? Um, and so that's what I'm saying. It's like that's scary stuff. And for someone to minimize that can be very reiterating the trauma, you know?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. No, it makes me think about how, I don't know, I think it's really easy to like understand, hey, how do you experience things? And then place that same type of how you experience things or respond to things as though everyone has that process or that thought process through something. And
Right.
so I don't know, thinking through the lens that I think that's really the heartbeat of empathy is what you're describing, right? Where it's
Mm-hmm.
like, how do well, I don't have panic attacks, so I can't connect with that. Well, okay, well, what would it look like for you to try to understand
Mm-hmm.
what they're going through? So would you recommend like, and if somebody has a kind of identifying, hey, what specific struggles do you have? And not only just talking to them about, like, what does that feel like for them, but also maybe doing some side research too of being like, okay, what is it like when people experience panic attacks? Because
Yeah.
maybe my partner can't iterate it in the most helpful way for me to understand, but some maybe trained professional iterated it really well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what you said before about empathy is a really powerful tool.
Yeah.
I mean, the two parts about empathy is, I couldn't imagine like if there was a death or something in someone's family, like, oh, my brother died. Well, I don't have a brother, but I have someone that was really close to me that was like a brother who did die. Or I couldn't imagine if my brother did die or my sister died. Like that would be really scary and really hard. And so
Yeah.
with that sort of conceptualization around kind of figuring out sort of like how can I be in their shoes, very
Mm.
cliche,
Yeah.
but it really does sort of project a sense of understanding and trying to understand the other.
Yeah.
Oh man, I couldn't imagine.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I wonder if part of that is also being able to acknowledge that you can't fully understand,
Yeah, right. Yeah.
right?
I
Where it's
mean, we're
like,
entirely different people. We're all wired differently. We all have our own thoughts. We're different humans.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I
Mm-hmm.
mean, we go back to that minimizing conversation. Like, it could probably be easy to be like, to because we don't want to compare, like, we don't want to compare trauma. We don't want to compare life events, right? Where it's like if someone shares, yeah, I lost, my brother just passed away, and you're like, yeah, I had a dog when I was little, and it was really hard when the dog passed away. You're comparing those things. Like, they can both be traumatic events, but it doesn't necessarily mean, it might be in some ways minimizing somebody else's experience when you just like compare it to yours. Is that fair?
I think that's really hard to say though, because I mean, you're trying at least, right?
That's
I
true. Yeah.
mean,
You're right.
I
Yeah.
sort of want to like take that. I don't know. I think if you're trying, then that's the powerful thing. I don't necessarily, I think that's the whole thing though, is like, how can I try? How can you be understood? I think what we as humans always desire is to be understood.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the commonality then we go to again of we all relate in our suffering no matter what. It's normalizing the fact that we all suffer. And so it's also not if anxiety and depression comes, it's when it will come. And that's the thing too, is that I think that people think like, oh, those crazy people out there have anxiety and depression, that's all mental illness, in this category of like that, when in reality, we all have symptoms of trauma and it comes out sideways. And I like to say that in a way that our symptoms come out sideways, whether that be the anxiety coming out in control, of wanting, of just, it just comes out in sideways. And so it's like, contextually speaking, we all suffer, we all have depression and anxiety. And so normalizing that we relate in that.
When you say something comes, like the symptoms come out sideways, is that like a reference to like how they manifest in our life, how they affect our behaviors? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yep, exactly. Yep.
Gotcha.
Yep. So a perfect example is like when people burn out and they have way too much on their plate and it bubbles up and bubbles up. And then all of a sudden, remember the alert of the amygdala is like, hello, alerting. It's coming out sideways then. So it can come out in panic attacks, come out in this insomnia. It can come out in yelling. It can come out in headaches and hypertension and stomach aches.
I mean, that's a really helpful understanding, because I think that kind of lends itself to if you see in yourself or you see in your significant other where they're responding to something in a way that seems extreme. I don't want to say like irrational, because it sounds like too harsh, but in a way that doesn't sound proportional to the situation. Is that one of those things where like, hey, maybe we need to trace back this source? Is that a fair thing to do?
I think in the moments like that, it's really powerful to just just be grounded first. It's how do I breathe through this right now? Because if we try to figure out every time that we have like a huge symptom that happens, that can be frustrating if we don't know. Because most of the time we don't really know. I mean, that's how complex our bodies are. If something from PTSD, and I say, PTSD from the little t traumas that we don't necessarily think of, it can be complex. And so we might not know. And so to say, I'm feeling this way and I'm not really sure, but I'm going to be grounded because I'm going to stay in the moment and I'm going to allow myself to sit with it.
Could you, what's like a breathing exercise? I know I did not prepare you at all for that type of question, okay. But I'm curious because you mentioned breathing a couple times, and that just sounds like a powerful technique. You say like, how can you become grounded and kind of recenter, get back to that midbrain?
So pretend you're having like a really severe panic attack, and in these cases, your breath is going to be up here in your chest. And so when your breath is up here and your mind is spiraling, what if I die? What if I this? What if I'm going through something? What I like to say with my kids, and even like with my adults too, is just to pretend that your belly is a balloon. And you sort of want to focus on pushing your belly out and kind of like it's like kind of putting your hand on your chest to see, yep, that's where I'm breathing right now, but then a hand on your belly and pushing your belly out to sort of exaggerate that you want to push that breath down and breathe through your belly. And sometimes when people, and this might be helpful for some people, maybe not for others.
Sure.
But for me, it's like 3 breaths on, out the nose, and it can be like too confusing for me or in the moment to like have to think about like that. And so what I do is I'm like, it's a good tool just to sort of be like, wow, I really am right up here. Okay, how do I push that breath down? And you come to realize that when you're then sort of exaggerating and breathing through your belly, in through your nose, out, but then focusing on the belly, it ends up getting your heart rate down and pushing that breath down to your belly, which can become then, because the mindfulness is focusing on the balloon in your belly.
And there's a lot in there that's super interesting. I think one of the things you mentioned was just that you're feeling your physical response, right? And so I think if we're feeling like, I don't know, I think there's a tendency that sometimes it can be easy for someone to, oh, I'm not anxious. I'm fine. It's like, well, maybe check,
Yes.
you
yes.
know, and hey, how are you breathing? Like, how's your response? How's your heart rate? And, be willing to like assess yourself in that way and then go through that mindfulness. That sounds like
absolutely
feels really practical. Yeah.
Yeah. It can be very powerful to be like, oh my gosh, it's so, again, our bodies are so connected with our thinking and our brains, like it's fascinating. Again, when I think of how God created our bodies, it's like how beautiful that tools that breath can be and how it's connected. And it is alerting us to care. To sit back and to pay attention, what do I need right now?
Yeah. And I mean, to go back to our topic of like, helping a significant other, I mean, that's really tangible too, right? Where it's like that reminder, hey, let's do the breathing stuff. And you can even do it with them, I suppose. 'Cause like you said, it may not, I think your response is learned, right? And so it might not be your go-to about, you may not think in the moment, I need to think about breathing, because we just breathe, right? And so having someone that's more grounded and maybe in the moment, being able to help us through that. Right?
Yeah. It can be really powerful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like I said, it's not if we have anxiety with the other, it's when we do.
Yeah.
That's the sort of the normalization of all of us is that.
Can you speak to maybe like the normalization? Like, how do we help somebody normalize? How do we help someone normalize healing from trauma, or how do we help someone normalize talking about mental health? Is that something that we can do?
I think what I usually take the approach of is, again, tell me your story. That must have been hard. I couldn't imagine.
Yeah.
Sorry, my Frenchie's going crazy. But it's that, of course you're going to feel like that. Of course, through that experience, you're going to feel tired and exhausted and scared and shameful at times. And so that's the thing too. It's like, for parents too, it's like they're exhausted. They don't feel good enough. They're so worried about their children, and then they don't think they're going to be a good parent. And then there's so many things that happen. I'm like, of course you're going to feel that way. And so when I mean normalizing, I think like, absolutely, you wouldn't be human if you weren't feeling that way.
Yeah.
When you've experienced all this stuff in your life, of course you're going to. I give you permission to.
Wow. That's really good. I think that the concept of permission, like it's okay. Hey, it's okay. You're allowed to feel this way. Cause I do feel like that can be a tendency where someone's like, I don't feel like I'm allowed to. Maybe I feel like I need to be the rock of the family or whatever. And I'm not allowed to have struggles.
Yeah. One really powerful thing is we're generally in our society scared of feeling.
Hmm.
You know, we think of feeling depressed as bad. We think anxiety, if we feel that, it's bad, like there's something wrong with me. The reality is feelings are feelings. They're nor good nor bad.
Hmm.
They are what they are, and they cannot hurt you.
Hmm.
And that is something too that I reiterate is like, your feelings cannot hurt you. They're part of our humanness. They're telling us something. It's part of how we were created, is to feel. And so they're not bad. We tend to think that anxiety is bad and depression's bad, when it really is just part of us. It's part of being a human. And I think when I look back to it, you know, I think about, that's one of the reasons why Jesus came, is to that relate to us as a human.
Yeah.
To show us the sense of like suffering of, he felt very hard feelings. He felt anxious. He felt depressed. He felt hard. And he felt angry, and he felt all these feelings to give us permission to be able to sit in our feelings as well.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think this really iterates that you don't have to feel guilty about having those feelings. So that's powerful. Kind of along the same lines as the idea of kind of expectations, like the permission, like you're allowed to feel this way.
Yeah.
Because I know expectations play a huge role in relationships. You know, unmet expectations can create bitterness. There's so many different things about expectations. Could you share maybe like, what are fair versus maybe unfair expectations that you can have for a significant other going through a mental health challenge?
I think there's sort of like two parts in that. How can we hold the both and of a relationship? How can we try to understand with compassion and love? And how can we have boundaries and accountability to the choice too? And I think that's sort of like the ongoing process of us healing and choosing to love and choosing our health journey, is, how do I hold these two? How do I hold my suffering and my feelings and all these traumas and all this stuff and the others with accountability and boundaries and love, if that makes sense?
Yeah.
So there's grace in that, right? I mean, there's grace in compassion and trying to see the other. And there's also loving boundaries that we need to have, to treat people with love and respect in the midst of knowing that we've been through a lot.
So from like a practical like mindset, is that like, hey, I know you're feeling the lack of control, or you're feeling stressed about this. Like, I acknowledge that, but it's still not okay to yell at me.
Correct.
Like that type of, okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Like, I love you. I hear you. I see you. I'm sorry. I'm maybe not understanding completely. And you do have a choice in this too, to understand my perspective as well, to understand where I'm coming from as well.
Would it be helpful to have like, I don't know, conversations when someone's feeling more grounded, to kind of outline some of these things and have these conversations when somebody is grounded, versus trying to have that conversation in the midst of, I don't want to say an outbreak. What's a good phrase for like an episode? Like, that sounds so extreme.
Yeah,
but,
sure. I think, generally, like in situations where we're not able to sort of be rational thinking, that space is needed for a break. I mean, that space is needed to calm your body down. It's like, what do you need right now? Well, you probably need a break. And I'm going to model that too. I'm going to give you about 10 minutes and I'm going to come check up on you so we can have a rational conversation. Let me know when you're ready. It's not fair for somebody to not really approach and be like, we're having this conversation now. And like, they're having a massive panic attack.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's really powerful. And I think, I don't know, I'm a big fan of I don't know, setting that as an expectation that's like, hey, just want to let you know if this is happening, maybe we'll do this. And like talking about those things beforehand. I mean, communication is so key, right? To
Huge.
where you're,
Yeah.
hey, this might be a reaction when you're going through this type of thing.
Right.
When you're facing extreme anxiety,
Mhm.
I'm going to give you a little bit of space with the acknowledgement that we are still going to talk about this reaction.
Yeah. And maybe, it's the vulnerable piece of too of, modeling. If you really do see that they're very heightened and they're not okay and they're really going through a really hard time, to say, you know what, I'm going to take a break quick. I need some space to process this. Because the last thing I want to do is like, it looks like you need a break. I'm ready, you know.
Yeah, that's
may be
fair.
the
That's
case,
fair. Yeah.
which may be the case, but or a thing can be like yelling like we need a break, for a few minutes.
Yeah.
But it's that sort of modeling the self-differentiation of, I notice myself in my anxiety as well, so I'm going to take a break and come
Yeah.
back and check up on you in 10 minutes or whatever.
Yeah. I know there's a lot of things in relationship guides or whatever that talk about, being aware of how those types of things might make someone feel, right? So if somebody has some abandonment stuff they haven't maybe necessarily processed through, the concept of a break in conversation might be terrifying because, and so I don't know. I've heard it expressed like, you can even say like, hey, I love you. We're good, but we're going to need to talk about this in this such and such amount of time. So like reaffirming that the status of relationship is still there.
Definitely. Yeah. And the
yeah.
checkup, like I'm going to check up on you. Like there's a plan there.
Yeah.
I'm not going to abandon you. Mm-hmm.
Is there any maybe general lessons to apply to someone, a partner going through mental health challenge?
I think the general lesson is very cliche again, but I refer to this poem that allows me to slow down to trust in my own process, and that it may take a very long time, but it's okay. And so trusting in our own process keeps us grounded of understanding it's okay. It doesn't have to look a certain way. I'm going to sit in this. So I have a poem here, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
To read. Okay.
Yeah.
It's by a French poet priest called Pierre Desjardins. Have you heard of him?
I have not.
Okay. This poem was a really powerful tool for me going through a master's degree and going through my own stuff in my life. It's called Patient Trust. Above all, trust in the slow work of God. We are quite naturally impatient in everything to reach the end without delay. We should like to skip the intermediate stages. We are impatient of being on the way to something unknown and something new. And yet it is the law of all progress that it is made by passing through some stages of instability, and that it may take a very long time. And so I think it is with you. Your ideas mature gradually. Let them grow. Let them shape themselves without undue haste. Don't try to force them on as though you could be today what time. That is to say, grace and circumstances acting on your own goodwill will make of you tomorrow. Only God can say what his new spirit gradually forming within you will be. And give the Lord the benefit of believing that his hand is leading you, and accept the anxiety of feeling yourself in suspense and incomplete.
There's a lot of permission in there.
Yeah.
That's a really good refrain. And what a perfect way to, I think, end our conversation. Thank you so much, Amber, for sharing. I feel like I've learned so much about the brain and about just, I think, really helpful responses. And
yeah, you're welcome. I really appreciate you guys asking me. It really is a privilege.
Yeah. Well, that was the second half of my conversation with Amber, and I want to give her just a big thanks for sharing so many helpful thoughts with us. 2 takeaways for me. One is the importance of giving someone permission to feel the way they feel and not minimizing it. And then also just the really practical tool of breathing. Well, thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge Community Church podcast, and make sure to follow and subscribe so that you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations.